Today's podcast is about debt restructuring with guest speaker Mr. Manjuka Fernandopulle, and it's hosted by Aneetha, our very own fellow at the Advocata Institute.
Hello and welcome to Advocata's podcast. Today we have with us Manjuka Fernandopulle. Manjuka is an independent legal counsel who is specialized in corporate law and financial transactions. His experience as an advisor on sovereign debt restructure and transactions, and it is a pleasure to have him on our podcast today. Manjuka, thank you for joining us.
Aneetha, thank you for having me, and it's nice to talk about a subject that once was abstract and now live. I mean, it was when I studied it, it was an abstract thing to me, but now we are living it, and everybody in this country is living debt restructuring.
So, as Manjuka has implied, our topic for today is on sovereign debt restructuring. What is it when we say we're going to enter into sovereign debt restructuring? What does that process look like, and what are the implications of entering into a sovereign debt restructuring? These are all some of the questions that we hope to answer today. So on that vein, Manjuka, could you start off by telling us a little bit about what Sri Lanka's position is right now, given that the country has officially defaulted and that we did default on our debt a few months ago now?
Let's let people understand what a sovereign debt default is. We have declared to the world that we are insolvent, that we don't have money to pay our debts as they come due, and so basically we are run out of money, and now we need to. So only way you tell the creditors or your creditors that you need to give us some relief in order so that we can meet your debts in the future, and that's where we are. So at the moment we have, as a country, we have announced to the world that we have no money. Simple as that, and we can't pay the debt. So what has now happened is that if you see to everybody implications is that's why you see that people can't access credit markets for banks to raise money. Banks cannot go to the market and get their trade lines, credit lines rolled over, because there is a risk that we have also insolvent, means we have also told that we don't have sufficient reserves to pay our debt. So it means that in case banks don't have money, they can't go to the central bank, and ask for money to foreign currency to meet their liabilities. That's why when we say we're insolvent, you can't get trade credit, and they can't roll over. And banks have now to have cash to pay for whatever imports we have, and that is sort of a sum and a way it will affect everybody, and in sort of.
So even though it's spoken of as a sovereign default, the impact of this default is really felt not only by the Treasury and the central bank and the public banks, but also by the private sector.
It affects everybody. I mean, it's like, unfortunately, unlike a company where it's sort of one part of the economy, this is the entire society as large is affected, and that's unfortunate thing about sovereign defaults. That's why countries try to avoid it in a way, because it is also how it works is that's the way the financial markets react to it, to ensure that once you declare that you can't pay, they cut you out for the financial system in a way to force you to enter into negotiations to start a program to repay, and that is where how they make the debtor country actually sort of force them to think about restructuring, or rather engaging the creditors also in a kind of so that it makes if they are forced, and it will only alternative they have to do. So otherwise, you see, because unlike a company, it may not have assets. It is a legal entity by itself in a country. The sovereign can set its own laws. So it is so when so how the financial system would work is to cut a country out of it, so that it has incentive to sort of getting to engage the creditors to repay. So good old days, they had when defaulted people sent gunboats, but now it is more the financial system that causes the country to sort of start a plan to repay.
Right.
And it does make also in reality it makes sense because it actually in fact also because what happens is you run out of reserves, so the banks cannot get money to pay for imports in case they don't have it, and that's how it works.
So, although the Sri Lankan government decided to announce the default and sort of enter the default preemptively, given the state of our debt, was this inevitable?
Well, the question is whether it is entirely whether we were preventive or we were forced to. I mean, Sri Lanka defaulted on what we know was almost run out of reserves.
Yeah.
So the argument they say is preemptively. I don't think it's a proper nomenclature to describe it, because preemptive debt would be in a situation where you think 6 months down the line I'll run out of money, but I have reserves of $5 billion. So I want to ensure that my people can eat and drink. I don't, because I know when moment of default, I have no access to credit markets. I have my banks will be difficult to the country's banks will access trade credits. So you have your reserves. You'll be able to use your reserve to support your financial institutions to import. But that is not the situation where Sri Lanka was. You see, one good example of a preemptive default was in Uruguay, where they moment Argentina defaulted because the economy was interlinked. I believe it is in 2001, Uruguay defaulted, and it's one of the places where the impact on the society was not felt that much. Ecuador, to a certain extent, also did it during the COVID pandemic, because tourism went down, the oil prices went down, so they also defaulted, and then within 6 months they were able to restructure the debt and basically get back some credibility in the market.
Right, right. So now that the country has defaulted on the debt, the kind of it has almost become a buzzword now is, now we're going to have to enter into sovereign debt restructuring.
Yes.
And while this has been discussed and debated and sort of bandied around in every sort of conversation since the default, and honestly prior to the default as well, it is quite difficult to find a very clear understanding of what sovereign debt restructuring really is.
I mean, to tell what sovereign debt restructuring in a sort of simplified way is that we are finding a path to what you call debt sustainability.
Yeah.
Is that you would be able to create a situation where you can meet your debts as they come due. So what you now have your situation where you have your debts, you can't pay your debts. You said that, put up your arms and said that you cannot pay your debts. Yeah. Now with the sovereign debt restructuring would be ensuring that you are once again solvent. Basically, you're a path to solvency, what you're looking for. That is what in somewhat debt restructuring is. So from insolvency, what's a path to solvency? That is debt restructuring.
Right. So could you shed a bit more light maybe on, you've kind of very succinctly put it as this path to part from in terms of like the solvency of the state, but when we speak about the process of debt restructuring,
so what happens in the debt restructuring process is that, you see, when you put your arms up now, you must understand that there are creditors, people you owe money to. In our case, that would be the bondholders.
Yeah.
People who have claims, so their money is acknowledged. You can't say that no, I owe you $1,000 and if he claims 1,000 rupees and I say no, I can't. There's no space to say that I have 100 rupees because I've acknowledged that, so I have to pay that. I have loans to bank. I might have loans to banks. Sri Lanka may have loans to banks, like to Chinese banks. Sri Lanka has borrowed on commercial terms. Then Sri Lanka has money owed to countries like Japan, India, China, China. Then also Sri Lanka owes money to multilateral institutions like ADB, which is a big creditor. And Sri Lanka owes money to IMF, World Bank. So when we have put our hands up and said that we have no money to pay our bondholders. So just to simplify what a bond is that acknowledged debt in a piece of paper. You say that you have given me 100 million. Over this one, I will pay over defined period certain amount of money, and at the end of it, I'll pay a bullet sum, a sum. It's not like unlike a bank loan, which is amortized, means as each installment you pay the interest and the credit. In a bond, it is you pay it at the end of a term, the entire thing, and it's also freely transferable. So just that people understand that the bond is. So that is so we have defaulted on our bonds. We have called what you call sovereign bonds. So Sri Lanka's in foreign currency have bonds. Then Sri Lanka has defaulted on what you call bilateral loans taken per country, and they said that they won't be able to after a cut-off date, they won't be able to pay those either the April 12th. So after April 12th, only new fresh financing they will finance. Other than that, the old financing they will not pay unless they intend to. They can give us some debt relief.
Right.
So that is basically what is the process, trying to attempt to obtain some debt relief, so that put it on become a solvency, but that debt restructuring. So what would this mean is that you then, since you don't have the money to pay, you need somebody to give you some money, or somebody to tell you that you are able give you some money, or give certificate that you're on a path to pay. So then we have approached the IMF, and in that process we have what we call a debt sustainability analysis. That's a DSA, which tells you if you meet certain targets, that means debt to GDP targets, you can become solvent again. So which means that what you do is you would have to look at your expenditure and your revenue, and as you increase your revenue while curtailing expenditure, and also in context in relation to the growth of economy, and come to a point where the IMF would say that if you follow this path, you will become solvent. So that's what first thing. When you use that, then you would next thing would be to hire some advisors who would advise you what you call what a debt debt restructuring indicative debt restructuring. But so what you need to do, they will look at and say, okay, you need to change your debt profile. You need to be able to reduce your debt by so many percentage in able to meet that. So then you would have to, then they will tell you'll have to go and speak to your creditors, either to get reduce your interest you pay for them, or you can get extension of the time period you pay for them, or you need to reduce the principal amount you paid for them. And those are the three things what you need to do. And then they may say that, look, you can't only deal with, you might have foreign creditors, you might have to have local creditors. You can't just do only bondholders, you'll have to do you might have to get relief from the multilaterals. So that is where what is the debt restructuring process is about.
Right.
So what debt restructuring processes happen is what you call NPV, on net present values.
Right.
So you bring down in order to get debt relief, you would always measure what you need to bring your present debt, bring it to what in net present value, and how much of on net present value you need to reduce to in order to meet the debt sustainability.
Okay.
So basically, that is where you start. So if some IMF tells you that you need to by 2020 you need to have your debt to GDP to 70%, 90% or something. Sri Lanka is, I believe, is 130%. So then you need to get your present debt, net present value of your present debt is so much. If you want to meet your targets, you need to reduce your net present value of your current debt to so much.
Right.
So you need to proposition that to your creditors, and they accept it. So sometimes the creditors would say, right, we can give you that net present value, we will give you, but you need to share it among the burden among creditors. So we can't be the only person you take. So because they will try to get the minimum as possible net present value discounts, for their debt, because they will try to say that every debtor has to take much, so that every debtor shares that burden. That's
Right.
where they will try to do. So that is the sum of a debt restructuring process. Most countries would try to keep that burden away from their internal economy and to find only foreign debt. But sometimes, as you said, if you can't meet the debt sustainability targets, which is sort of considered to be where you can be part of solvency, you might have to take the pain to your internal economy and do what you call basically local debt restructuring. Now, sometimes what happens is that you make certain types of debt, like debts which central bank holds up for the government, not infinite debt.
Right.
Debt for longer periods of time. I mean, so that there's no maturity in the debt. You just pay the coupon, and there's the debts in perpetuity, so that you don't keep it. So there is various methods. If the local debt, they look at various options. Sri Lanka's unfortunately problem is that most of our bond debts also, I mean, comparatively 10 years. So it's a short-term debt and high-yield debt.
Yeah.
So we may have to, in order to meet the debt sustainable targets, probably the fair amount of debt, what you call debt reduction, debt relief, may be needed. Even the Chinese banking debt, which is also considered commercial debt, would also have to be reduced in its burden.
Okay.
But there is also a school of thought that we may need local debt restructuring, which would require reducing payment of, if it's near term, maybe payment of the principal amount, or extending the maturities of those debt.
Right. So before we kind of explore some of the next steps a bit in further detail, I'd like to ask you. You kind of mentioned in the process of doing a debt sustainability analysis. A part of that, a component of that, is looking at the government's finance position, looking at the government's fiscal position,
Yes.
rather. So, given Sri Lanka's current position, in terms of our domestic policy, what is it that needs to be done to aid this process?
So we would have to, basically, it's debt sustainability would be looking at two sides of the coin. One is revenue, one is expenditure.
Right.
So revenue would mean, so government, see, now the government has declared to the world that it's insolvent, which means that its space to borrow from the rest of the world is limited. So what, if the government is able to do, it can transfer the burden of non-taxation, that borrow from the other countries from the foreign financial markets, and not burden the taxpayer to meet its fiscal deficits. So when the government can't do that, it has its limited space, its policy options are doing it is limited. So it will have to then raise taxes, sell assets, and on the expenditure side, it probably have to cut down expenditure. You'll have to find gaps and rationalize the expenditure. It is also then another, because in a DSA will also would mean that you will also want to bring your debt to GDP down, which means even domestic debt, the government's space to borrow comes down. So government would have to keep to particular fiscal targets. It would have to keep to achieving primary balances. It would have to it also means that government will have to have what you call fiscal responsibility, and say that, okay, we only in contingencies when we have to borrow from the local government bank. It has, so basically what happens is, when if the sustainability is bring down from 130% to about 90%, that of GDP, that may be also aided by GDP growth, but it also may be, it has to be brought down, that the ability to borrow and add on to the existing burden has been brought down.
So essentially, from the perspective of domestic policy, through this, regardless of the fact that debt restructuring will be taking place, there is a lot of policy change that has to happen.
Exactly, it has happened
to aid the process.
And you must understand, this is not, what I failed and people understand is now that we have there are actors that who were not constituents to government policy earlier. In the sense that you earlier people think, one of the things that I feel that people think now the government just can, go to the IMF, get some money and, everything, or there is, they can sort of have 100 ministries, do something, which they don't realize that there are other people, external actors now in creditors watching what is happening, because they expect to get paid.
Yeah.
So they will also want the government to not, won't be do a business as usual.
Right.
They can't have large rest. They can't have, go and give election gundus or person. So they are also watching what the government is doing. What they want is credibility from the government. They may engage with the government. They will want a government that has credibility, will be able to give a plan to them and stick to the plan so they get paid. Because what those creditors have is rights. They are, like any domestic, any default in a domestic, they also have the similar rights to go to courts. Therefore, we have given them those rights, and they can make our Sri Lanka's life miserable again, because they can, by long as the debt is outstanding, we will be still considered defaulted. We will be insolvent, and we will go on like this forever and ever. So they know that, and they know, knowing that, they will also want the government to behave in a manner that, only if they behave in a manner that gives credibility to the process, gives them plan that they can pay, and stick to it, that they will also engage to give some debt relief so that we can start our country again.
So you mentioned the fact that the creditors have the ability to sue the government.
Yes, indeed.
And I think this has already taken place with the Hamilton Reserve Bank suing Sri Lanka. And I believe this has sort of taken place under or through the collective action clause.
It's not the collective action clause. Basically,
Right.
what has happened. So the collective action clause is something different. It's
Right.
it's an instrument in the terms of it's ensuring that there is there's collectivity in sort of the debt restructure, where one party just cannot uphold when the majority of the creditors agree to something. He cannot just hold out and say, no, I'm not willing to do it, because it's so that it's a process where so that collectively everybody can come to some agreement. So over a certain threshold, that is a collectivity act. This is not, basically what they are saying is that we promised them to pay. And we we have $1 billion bond which matured in July. We over the last 1 year, we repeatedly assured them they went and bought $250 million of it. Now you are saying you can't pay us the money. It's simple as that. They're going to try to collect their money. That's what their claim is. They're also saying is that another thing is what you call a paripasukla, They are saying that according to the statement, that we are giving preference to one creditor over another creditor. And there is a clause in the credit debt contracts, or the bond contracts, which says that Sri Lanka's external debt means, or Sri Lanka's debt which is denominated except in Sri Lankan rupees, you can't pay one debtor whilst not paying the other debtor. There's a clause. So they are citing that clause and saying, look here, you have said that you're going to pay the SLDB debtors, but we are not getting paid. Also, I think in that clause, our particular clause, external indebtedness clause, covers in fact multilateral debt, because all debt denominated except in Sri Lankan rupees is cannot be paid. One debtor cannot give preference to another according to that clause. So what they are trying to do is get an injunction preventing Sri Lankan government from paying one type of creditors in preference to other creditors. That's what they are trying to do. But I believe what their actual aim is trying to get sort of extract much money as possible and get a minimum haircut or whatever, minimum debt burden on themselves. They will like to see the burden shift to the local debt holders. If they will like to see so they will try to see that. That's what seems to be what they are doing. So because they have a right, but having said that, they have a right. It's a plain thing. We have acknowledged that to pay $1 billion. We have not paid, and we are defaulted on it. So their case is plain. the plain vanilla case, it says you promised me to pay and I not paid. That's it.
Right. So, apart from that, there's been a lot of discussion around the IMF agreement that is currently being negotiated and has been in the negotiation process for a while, actually. What role does the IMF have to play in the debt restructuring? Is it simply a sort of signaling of credibility, or is it something more?
Now, IMF is sort of, I think it's called plays a role of anchor. So IMF, I mean, IMF itself has, if to IMF to lend in terms of Article 6 of its articles agreement, I it's what I nomenclature used. You cannot lend. IMF cannot lend to government to a country to pay its debt. It can pay. It can support. It can only give to support its foreign currency and its basic balance of payments. That's what it wants. You cannot do, because IMF money is actually public money, right? Taxpayers' money. So the IMF, the more shareholders of IMF have said that you can't use IMF money to pay that, and only they can lend if the debt is sustainable.
Right.
So that has been implicitly a process to show to the creditors also, like, look here, when IMF gives you the money, they will tell you or show that they're on a path to solvency, and it's a sort of a ballpark process to show that IMF will say that now the government has agreed with IMF to a path to solvency. We are an insolvent country seeking money from the IMF. We are not a country seeking IMF like Bangladesh has done to support its imports, where they feel that reserves may be hampered into get their oil imports, their various commodity food imports. That is not the situation. Meet their trade bills. We are borrowing money now because we don't have money to, basically our reserves are run out. Right. That's exactly where we have approached the IMF. So we approaching the IMF as an insolvent country, and before the IMF comes in, what they do is they would do something called a debt sustainability analysis, which I alluded to earlier, so that the government would tell the government, you need to do X, Y, Z to become a solvent country again. Then, anchored to the Article 6, IMF also has what you call the debtors in default, lending into default policy. So the IMF has a policy saying it doesn't tolerate, for example, where a country that defaulted on its repayments of the World Bank, IMF will not. IMF will tell the government, will the country to go and say, you need to speak to the World Bank, and if the World Bank says that agrees to you, then they will what you call debtors in then they will apply debtors in default policy, and then with the concurrence of the IMF, with the World Bank or a financial institution, international financial, they have defaulted to, and if there's a credible plan, the IMF will start. So that's where the IMF also has a set of rules which ensure that a country sort of engages the creditors before it starts defaulting. So it's anchor. It has a sort of a role as an anchor to play. Maybe in local sort of a domestic restructuring, it would be more of a manager of a administrator of a scheme of arrangement, or so that is where the analogy would be there in these local things.
Right. So another sort of buzzword that has been thrown around is this of bridging finance, and saying that this is the next step that we need to be thinking of, or not thinking of. That's that kind of the next step of this process, rather. Could you shed some light on what
now
this
bridging
is?
finance, which when my understanding of what bridging finance had been, mostly so because IMF will not lend to debtors in default, what you call in situations of default, where for example countries are not paid its IMF dues. IMF has not paid World Bank. Now Sudan had that problem. Right. So IMF could not lend to it. Neither it can. So no other institution could lend to it. So sometimes friendly countries, as the precedent I have seen, is they will give finance to finance the IMF or whatever institution that prevents the default that is not being paid, give that money to pay that in order to access IMF funding.
Right.
That is what bridging finance. The first time that I have seen this idea of the bridging finance to finance consumption, it has. I don't see precedents of this.
Okay.
It's I don't know where it suddenly came off that you get bridging finance to see, because now what was, let me look at this. India from today, from the day if we defaulted today, has given 5 billion more. Now that adds to the debt burden. Now we have said that we are not going to restructure that, we're going to pay that in full. But anyway, that adds to the DSA, because they will not, the creditors will not say like, look here, why should we give them? I mean, it's all voluntary. Why should one creditor get over another? So the creditors will push to say that, look, you need to bring them to the debt mix, and those may also fall back. We can say whatever we can say, but that only complicates something. So I have never seen this precedent of what they call bridging finance. And now, so mostly what I've seen in bridging finance is in a sort of where it is sort of limited amount now. For example, Sudan got $1 billion from France to pay its IMF dues.
Okay.
So what happened is, moment the IMF money came in Sudan's restructure of its debt after over years, when al-Bashir after had defaulted on debt and the new government come, they restructured those. They had to come to negotiations, and that is mostly bank debt and multilateral debt and bilateral debt. So the French gave the money. Moment the IMF gave the money, the Sudanese paid that money and started the IMF program. And whilst that process was going on, the other parties restructured the debt. Like it was bank debt, I believe, and also multilateral and bilateral debt.
I see.
So so basically bridging finance, it's seen in everyday commercial things, where until you get loans or short-term financing instrument, until you can access long-term financial lending, it's seen every day, it's done. So, but I have not seen in the context of a debt restructuring of governments borrowing money to finance its consumption.
Right. All right. Thank you. So before we kind of wrap up, I just have sort of one final question for you. What is your outlook on Sri Lanka's debt restructuring process?
Well, see, the thing is that to me, I think we need to sell a little bit of it. I think what has happened is that I feel that we need to show that we are serious, we are credible, that we can push reforms, and we can get GDP growth. That's very clear. I think what's happening is now is that there is very conservative GDP growth estimations that are happening in the DSA. And that's because of that, now creditors are looking this way, that way to see whether we should push the burden on the domestic market. That is, I think, one thing. I think unfortunately for us, that we kept it to the last moment, and we kind of gave the market saying we are going to pay, and then did not pay. That ruined our credibility. So we need to be able to get back credibility. We need to be able to show that we are going the extra mile. We are going to think out of the box. We are changing ourselves, and then we are doing things to get GDP growth soon as in the near term as possible. Right. If we do so, and we need to do so, we need to fix. I think one of the things that we need to fix is our tourism industry. We need to because tourism is one factor has not worked, and we need to get the debt burden out of the tourism industry. Has also a lot of FX debt in there. We need to get that. We need to get some liquidity into the market, and show that show that tourism numbers work in the meantime, and get to give credibility to our estimations of GDP growth. Then the creditors will also start thinking, okay, these people, we can let them, we will believe them. Perhaps we can also, in my opinion, is put the money where our mouth is, and give what you call GDP warrants. So, for example, we will tell the creditors, okay, we will give you get a haircut, NPV haircut of so much, but if we are saying our economy will grow so much, so will increase the value of your debt over your payments over so many period. Okay. If because our debt is, so you really then get them to do a leap of faith in it, and hopefully we can convince it. It's a difficult thing, But I am optimistic about it.
That's great to hear. So thank you so much for joining us today,
Thanks.
Manjuka.
Yeah. Thank you, Aneetha,
given
for
us,
having me.
You've given us a lot of insight into the process of debt restructuring, the various options available for us. We can reduce the principal, we can extend the maturity, we can reduce or adjust the interest rate. You've also given us a lot of perspective as to what needs to happen parallel to the debt restructuring process in terms of domestic policy, and the sort of signaling that we are sort of credible and committed to this process. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aneetha, for having me and giving the opportunity of engaging with you and the public and everybody. That's a great response. Thank you.
Wonderful.
You can listen to this podcast on Anchor, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember to follow us on all our social media platforms for more exciting content. See you in the next episode.